Hey guys, so in today's video I'm going to talk about the use of APC sensor lenses on APC sensor cameras and full frame cameras, and full frame lenses on APC sensor cameras and full frame cameras. Let's just get straight into the video. Well, hello there. So there's like construction work right behind me at the moment because we are getting, I don't know what it's called, altaner? Altaner? How do you say an altaner? Balconies, yeah. So we're getting balconies set up on the building and they're setting up the whole construction yard at the moment. This might be a little bit noisy, but I hope I can go through this video because when you have children like I do, you really just have to find some time where your kids are not around if you want to make a less noisy video, and I take it that my kids will be more noisy than the construction thing going on behind me. So yeah, bear through this please. Before we talk about lenses, let's first briefly talk about the backbones of all of our cameras, and that is really the sensor. As you might know, cameras come with different size of sensors, and an APC sensor on an APC sensor camera is a smaller sensor if you compare it to a full frame camera like this one. This is really good to know because this actually affects more of the output than the lenses do themselves. So these APC sensor cameras like the A6000 here has a smaller lens, and this is also why the camera can be produced in a smaller size, and generally why the lenses for this kind of camera are smaller. This is actually a full frame lens, but yeah, don't mind this. So the approximate size of an APC sensor like the Sony one here is 23.5 millimeter times 15.6 millimeter. On a full frame body like this camera here, the sensor actually has a size of 36 millimeter times 24 millimeter, which makes it equivalent to a traditional 35 millimeter film camera. So the reason why I want to address the sensor size of the cameras so quick in this video is that it really affects the output of every scenario that we can put together here, like taking an APC sensor lens and put it on a full frame, or taking a full frame lens and putting it on an APC sensor camera, and vice versa. It is my general belief that many people think that it's the lenses that influence the output of the camera, but in many cases it is actually the sensor that is affecting how your camera performs and what kind of image that you get out of the camera. So three things will always be different when you're shooting on an APC sensor camera compared to a full frame, no matter the lens choice. And this means that no matter what kind of lens that you put on the camera, these things will affect the image that you produce with the camera and the lens. The focal length is the first thing that will be influenced by the APC sensor. So the APC sensor has a crop, as you might know. On a Sony camera, this is 1.5. This means that you actually have to multiply the length of your lens with 1.5 to get the right focal length that the camera produces. So for a 35 millimeter like this one here, you have to multiply this by 1.5, which makes it equivalent to a 52.5 millimeter lens. And again, just to clarify this does not matter if you put on a APC sensor lens like this one or full frame equivalent like the one that I'm shooting on at the moment. The crop will always be there, so it will always resemble a 52.5 millimeter lens. So if you put on the 35 millimeter OSS APC sensor lens on a full frame camera, because of the sensor size, this will be equivalent to a 35 millimeter. So it doesn't matter if you use the APC sensor lens or the full frame lens of this size, which is 35 millimeter. So yeah, there's no crop factor here. So another thing that will also be affected by the sensor size is the depth of field. This is something that we mostly relate to aperture, but the sensor size will also affect how we perceive the depth of field when shooting on a camera. This means that on the APC sensor camera, the bokeh or the depth of field will be less pronounced, it will be deeper, you can see more even when you're shooting at the same aperture. There will be less that is out of focus. I hope you get the point now. And if we compare it on the full frame camera, no matter which kind of lens, the depth of field will be the same. It will be more shallow, and it will produce a more pronounced bokeh effect. So both the background and the foreground will be more blurred related to where you focus on the image. So the last thing is light. So being a smaller sensor on the APC sensor camera, it will catch less light than it will on a full frame camera. And again, this has nothing to do with the aperture. It is because of the sensor on the particular camera. This means if you're using the exact same lens and the exact same settings, when you take a photo on an APC sensor camera and compare to a photo on a full frame camera, the image should appear a bit more dark on the APC sensor camera than on the full frame. And now I talked a bit about the aperture, and you might ask, what about the aperture? Because me myself, I've heard several times that if you use a full frame lens on a APC sensor camera, you will not have the same aperture as you will if you use this kind of lens on a full frame camera. This is simply not true. Aperture refers to the opening on the lens that open up when you use it and determines how much light the lens will pass through into the camera. This is a physical element in your lens, and this will not change no matter which camera you use if it's the same lens. For instance, the 35mm 1.8 OSS has an f-stop of 1.8, and this is the biggest the lens can open up. And this will be the same on the full frame camera and on the APC sensor camera. The thing that matters here is how the sensor will be affected by the light. So in theory, a 1.8 is the same on a full frame camera and on an APC sensor camera, no matter if you're using an APC sensor lens or a full frame lens that goes to 1.8. So as I talked about before, the APC sensor camera will use the light that it gets from the lens in a less pronounced way than the full frame because of the sensor size. Also, the bokeh will be less pronounced on the APC sensor camera, and this also has to do with the smaller sensor and the crop factor. Because the smaller sensor captures a narrower angle of view, it will make objects appear to be closer together, resulting in more of the scene to be in focus. So even though we relate these kind of features to aperture, this has nothing to do with the aperture on the lens, but it has to do with the sensor on the camera. Let's jump on to the next part now. An APC sensor lens on an APC sensor camera is not that interesting right now because I actually just told you about how the APC sensor camera will affect the image that you get, no matter which kind of lens that you produces. This means that really will not matter if you use this kind of lens or a full frame lens on the camera, because the image will still be affected by the same things that we just have gone through. So in this section I will talk more about how an APC sensor lens will work on a full frame body like the Sony a7 III here. So to make it really brief, I will just try to summarize what we just have gone through, because the things that will not be affected here on the full frame body is the focal length. It will stay the same. It will be a 35mm no matter what. The aperture will still be 1.8, and then in theory it will let in the same amount of light, and it will produce the same depth of field as the full frame equivalent lens to the 35mm. But this is in theory, because since this lens here is made for a camera with a smaller sensor, it is only supposed to work with this smaller area of the sensor. So when you put this on your full frame body, it will not cover the entire part of the sensor, creating this sort of really black vignette around your image. And this area will be useless, so what you need to do is you have to crop in to get rid of it, or your camera might do this for you. But this means that you're not using this portion of your sensor on your full frame camera. So when you crop the image, you are reducing the overall image resolution of your photo or video, and you're utilizing less area of the sensor. So yeah, this just means that you won't be able to take fully advantage of the larger sensor on this full frame camera, such as improved low light, the higher dynamic range, and in general the overall better image. Another thing to keep in mind if you want to use the APC sensor lens on a full frame camera is that the auto function might not work as good as if you were using the native full frame equivalent. Because this lens is made to work on the APC sensor camera, it might not perform as well on the full frame camera, and this might result in the autofocus working slower or not as great. And for instance, myself, I have experienced this with this 35mm OSS on the Sony A7 III, where when I focus in video, it was not using all of the auto function areas on the camera. It was more focusing like in general on an area, and I just found it also to be not as accurate on the focusing. It would not focus where I wanted to. If I was using like the spot focus, it kind of missed it sometimes, and in general it just didn't work that well as it could have had if I was using the native lens 35mm that I'm using right now. So yeah, you have to keep this in mind if you are going to use APC sensor lenses on your full frame body. So here in the last part we will talk about using a full frame sensor on an APC sensor body like the A6000. And basically all the things we talked about using the APC sensor lens on the APC sensor camera also applies to using the full frame lens on the APC sensor camera. Because the sensor is smaller, it affects the focal length, the depth of field, the amount of light, and these will affect the way you perceive the image coming out of the camera. And also, as we just talked about before, the auto function might not work as well as it would if I was using the Sony 50mm on a full frame body instead of on an APC sensor body. I must say though that at least with some of these general Sony lenses like the 50mm and the 85mm that I've been using on the A6000, I do not really experience that the auto function works worse than when I'm using the native APC sensor lenses on this camera. So it might not be the best option to use a full frame lens on an APC sensor camera. To my experience with the A6000, I don't experience anything that would mean that I wouldn't recommend doing this or that I wouldn't use this myself. You just have to keep in mind that the best option in the end would be to have a native APC sensor lens on your APC sensor camera, just as it would as having a full frame lens on your full frame camera. So to summarize what I've just said, the overall image will be more affected by the sensor size of your camera than which kind of lens that you use. However, you can more easily get away with using full frame lenses on APC sensor cameras than vice versa using APC sensor lenses on full frame cameras, because simply you will lose the benefits of the full frame sensor of your camera, and then it doesn't really make sense to have a full frame camera if you do not use it. And also, if you want to make sure to have the best autofocus, it is best to use a native lens for your camera type, no matter what. So I hope you found this video useful and that it helped you clarify how the different camera sensors work and how these different lenses actually do work on different cameras. And of course, remember to subscribe. It really helps a lot and I really appreciate it. And that is all for now, and I will see you around in the next video, guys. Boy!